The suitcase had been standing by the door for 3 days before I finally admitted it was not there by accident. I had placed it upright, handle facing me, as if it were a person waiting to be acknowledged. Each time I passed through the narrow hallway, my foot brushed against its corner, and I felt the small jolt of guilt that came with pretending not to see something that demanded a decision. I told myself I was just organizing, just testing how it would feel to have one thing ready. In truth, I was rehearsing a departure I had not yet given myself permission to make. I lived in a careful quiet then. I measured the volume of my footsteps, the tone of my voice, the amount of space my body took up in a room. Silence was not empty. It was a set of rules I followed without remembering when I had agreed to them. I had learned that peace was achieved not by speaking honestly, but by predicting his moods, by smoothing the air before it could turn sharp. When people talk about fear, they imagine shouting and slammed doors. What I knew was subtler. The constant calibration, the way my breath would pause before a sentence, checking whether it was safe to continue. That morning, the light through the kitchen window was too bright, the kind that exposes dust in the air and makes ordinary objects look staged. He sat at the table scrolling through his phone, his face relaxed in a way that meant nothing was wrong yet. I poured coffee and watched my hands to keep them steady. My reflection in the dark surface of the counter looked smaller than I remembered, as if I had been edited down over time. I tried to recall when I had stopped recognizing myself without context, when my moods had begun to depend entirely on his. The decision to leave did not arrive like courage. It came like fatigue. I was tired of explaining bruises that did not show, of apologizing for reactions to provocations no one else witnessed. I was tired of believing that love required endurance above all else. The suitcase was not packed with hope, it was packed with practicality. Clothes I could wear anywhere, documents I had quietly gathered, a notebook where I had written phone numbers in case my own device disappeared. Each item felt like a small act of defiance disguised as preparation. I remember thinking that if I could just get through the day, I would say the words out loud. Not an argument, not a confession, just a statement of fact. I would leave. I practiced it in my head while washing dishes, while folding laundry, while nodding at comments that demanded agreement. The words felt fragile, like they might dissolve if exposed too early. Still, having them there changed the shape of the room. The walls seemed closer, as if the house sensed it was about to lose something it believed it owned. There were signs I ignored even then. The way his questions lingered longer than usual, the way his eyes tracked my movements when I crossed the room. Control does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it sharpens quietly, waiting. When he asked why the suitcase was out, I said I was sorting clothes. The lie slid out easily, practiced by years of necessity. He nodded, but the air shifted. I felt it settle on my skin like static. In the afternoon, I stood alone in the bedroom and touched the zipper of the suitcase. My hands were shaking, and I let them. For once, I did not scold my body for reacting. Fear was information. I was beginning to understand, not weakness. It was telling me something important about what came next. I sat on the edge of the bed and imagined a version of myself who woke up without bracing for impact, who spoke without rehearsing, who existed without permission. The image was faint, but it was enough to make my chest ache. When he came home that evening, the house felt smaller. The hallway seemed longer, the distance between rooms charged with meaning. I stood near the door, the suitcase beside me, and felt the weight of the moment settle into my bones. Leaving was no longer theoretical. It was a physical act, measured in steps. I told myself that whatever happened next, the decision had already been made. I had chosen myself in the quiet, and that choice, once made, could not be undone without cost. I did not know then how much that cost would be. I only knew that staying had become more dangerous than leaving, and that realization, heavy as it was, felt like a form of clarity. I placed my hand on the handle and took a breath that felt like crossing a line. I used to believe rules were written things, posted on walls or spoken aloud with consequences attached. The rules I lived by were quieter, absorbed through repetition until they felt like instinct. Don't contradict him in public. Don't laugh too loudly when he's tired. Don't ask questions that sound like doubt. I followed them the way people follow gravity, not because I agreed, but because resisting hurt more. Over time, I stopped noticing the pain as something separate from daily life. I remember the first time someone asked why I always checked my phone before answering a message. I laughed it off, said it was a habit. The truth was that I had learned timing mattered more than truth. A delayed response could mean suspicion. A fast one could mean interruption. I lived in the narrow space between, calibrating myself constantly. That kind of vigilance rewires you. It teaches your body to stay alert even in rest, to listen for footsteps that signal a shift in weather. He was not cruel all the time. That was the most confusing part and the most educational in hindsight. Cruelty that is consistent is easier to name. What I experienced came in waves, softened by apologies and affection that felt sincere enough to reset the clock. After an outburst, there would be gifts, promises, a version of him who spoke gently and said he understood. I wanted to believe change was happening because believing felt safer than accepting the alternative. I began to edit myself long before I considered leaving. I stopped wearing certain clothes because they invited comments. I stopped meeting friends because it took too much explanation to justify their presence in my life. Isolation did not arrive as a command. It arrived as a convenience. It was easier to shrink my world than to defend my right to occupy it. Each compromise seemed small at the time, but together they formed a cage I could not see from the inside. What I did not understand then was that control often disguises itself as concern. He asked where I was going because he worried. He wanted access to my accounts because transparency meant trust. When I hesitated, the narrative shifted. If I had nothing to hide, why resist? I learned to hand over pieces of myself to keep the peace, convincing myself that love required proof. The more I gave, the more was expected, until privacy itself felt like betrayal. There were moments when my body reacted before my mind caught up. A tightening in my stomach when I heard his key in the door. A flinch when a glass was set down too hard. I told myself I was sensitive, dramatic, overthinking. That language did not come from nowhere. It had been offered to me repeatedly until I adopted it as my own. Self-doubt is a powerful tool. It keeps you busy arguing with yourself instead of asking why you feel unsafe. The suitcase by the door unsettled him because it broke an unspoken rule. I was not supposed to imagine a future that did not include him. When he asked questions, they were framed as jokes, but the humor was thin. I answered carefully, feeling the old instinct to soothe, to de-escalate. At the same time, something in me had shifted. I noticed the pattern as it happened, like watching a familiar scene with the sound turned off. Awareness did not make it easier, but it made it clearer. That night, lying awake beside him, I stared at the ceiling and traced the cracks with my eyes. I thought about how many decisions I had made based on fear, how many times I had mistaken endurance for loyalty. There was an educational clarity in that inventory, painful but necessary. I began to see that the rules I followed were not laws of nature. They were choices I had been pressured into making, and choices, however ingrained, could be unmade. I did not confront him then. I did not announce my realization or demand change. What I did was quieter and more dangerous in its own way. I stopped believing the rules were inevitable. That belief had been the foundation of everything else. As it weakened, the structure around me began to creak. I lay there listening to his breathing, understanding for the first time that leaving was not an act of betrayal. It was an act of education, one my life depended on learning. I learned the shape of his apologies the way some people learn a language, through repetition and survival. They always began with intensity, a sudden seriousness that felt like relief after tension. He would lower his voice, slow his movements, as if calm itself were proof of sincerity. I wanted to believe him because belief promised rest. It promised that the pain had a purpose, that endurance would eventually be rewarded with stability. The words were familiar. He didn't mean it. He was under stress. I had pushed him without realizing it. Responsibility was acknowledged just enough to sound mature, then quietly redirected. By the end, I was apologizing too, grateful for the chance to restore order. The pattern educated me slowly. teaching me that conflict could be erased if I was willing to doubt my own experience. There was always affection afterward. A hand on my back, a gift, a plan for the future spoken with conviction. Those moments were intoxicating because they rewrote the recent past. My body would relax, my mind eager to file the incident away as resolved. Trauma does not always feel violent in the moment. Sometimes it feels like relief. That confusion kept me tethered longer than fear ever could. Over time, I noticed the warning signs, though I did not yet know what to call them. The apologies came faster, the incidents closer together. The space for my reactions grew smaller. If I was still hurt after forgiveness had been offered, that became the new problem. Holding on to pain was framed as cruelty. Letting go was framed as love. I learned to swallow emotions quickly, before they could be used against me. Friends would ask questions I could not answer honestly. I defended him reflexively, protecting the version of him that existed during apologies. To admit the full pattern would have meant admitting how trapped I felt, how much I had normalized. Denial was not ignorance, it was strategy. I needed the narrative to hold, because without it, the ground beneath me disappeared. The educational moment came quietly one afternoon when he apologized before I had even spoken. The speed of it startled me. He knew the script so well he could perform it preemptively, neutralizing a conflict before it fully formed. I realized then that the apology was not about accountability. It was about control. It was a reset button that returned us to the same starting point, unchanged. That realization did not free me immediately. Knowledge rarely does, but it lodged itself in my chest, heavy and undeniable. Each apology after that felt thinner, its edges visible. I began to understand that remorse without change is not repair, it is maintenance. It keeps a system running exactly as it is. When I think back now, this was when leaving became inevitable, even if I did not yet act. Once you see a pattern clearly, you cannot unsee it. Love stopped sounding like endurance and started sounding like mutual safety. His apologies continued, but they no longer educated me into staying. They educated me into preparing. I carried that understanding quietly, the way people carry fragile things through crowded rooms. It changed how I listened, how I remembered, how I planned. The suitcase by the door was no longer just a possibility. It was an answer forming, shaped by every apology that asked me to forget what my body already knew. I began planning the way people plan in hostile territory, quietly, with contingencies layered over hope. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would announce itself as escape. I learned which days he stayed out later, which moods made him inattentive. I memorized the location of my documents, copied what I could, hid duplicates in places he never touched. Preparation became a private education, one that taught me how much intelligence I had been forced to suppress in order to survive. I stopped sharing my thoughts out loud, not because I had none, but because keeping them to myself felt like reclaiming a small room inside my own head. In that space, I could think clearly. I researched shelters, laws, support lines, reading late at night with the screen dimmed, my body tense at every sound. I learned words I should have known earlier, terms that explained my experience without minimizing it. Naming things correctly changed their weight. What had once felt like personal failure began to look like a pattern with consequences. There was guilt threaded through every plan. He had taught me well. The idea of leaving felt like betrayal, even though I could list the ways I had already been betrayed. I interrogated myself constantly, checking for exaggeration, for unfairness. Education in abuse is slow because it asks you to undo years of internalized doubt. Still, the facts held steady. Fear, isolation, control. The evidence was not dramatic, it was cumulative. I practiced conversations that would never happen. I imagined saying I was leaving calmly, imagined him understanding, imagined an ending that did not require secrecy. Those fantasies dissolved quickly under scrutiny. Reality had taught me that clarity provoked escalation, not closure. Safety would not come from honesty, it would come from distance. Accepting that was one of the hardest lessons. It went against everything I had been told about love and communication. My body reacted to the planning before my mind fully caught up. I slept lightly, woke early, my senses sharpened. There was a strange energy in it, a mix of terror and purpose. For the first time in a long while, my fear was aligned with my survival rather than used against it. That alignment felt powerful, even when it exhausted me. I tested my independence in small ways. I stayed out a little longer than usual, let messages go unanswered for minutes instead of seconds. Each act sent a ripple of anxiety through me, but also a signal. I was still here, still capable of choosing. When he noticed, his questions sharpened. I deflected, minimized, smiled. The performance continued, but now I understood its mechanics. I marked mental exits everywhere I went. The fastest route out of a room, the person I could call if something went wrong. I memorized addresses like lifelines. This was not paranoia, it was adaptation. People who live under threat develop skills that look like overreaction from the outside. From the inside, they are simply how you stay alive. What surprised me most was the grief that accompanied the planning. Not grief for him, but for myself. For the years I had spent negotiating instead of living, for the confidence I had surrendered piece by piece. Acknowledging that loss hurt more than the fear of leaving. It meant admitting the damage was real. It also meant admitting it mattered. By the time the plan felt solid enough to trust, something in me had already crossed over. I was still physically there, still playing my role, but internally I had moved. I was no longer imagining a different life as an abstract concept. I was building it quietly, step by careful step, aware that education does not always arrive in classrooms. Sometimes it arrives as a map drawn in the dark, leading you out of a place you were never meant to endure. The morning began with ordinary sounds, which is what made it so unsettling in retrospect. The kettle clicked off. A car door slammed somewhere down the street. Sunlight slid across the kitchen floor in a way that suggested routine, continuity, the lie of normal life. I remember thinking that if someone had walked in then, they would have seen nothing remarkable. Two people moving through shared space, familiar objects, practiced gestures. That ordinariness was its own kind of disguise. I moved carefully, aware of every motion. My body had learned to anticipate before my mind could intervene. I chose neutral clothing, something that would not draw comment, not invite interpretation. The suitcase remained by the door, untouched since the night before, its presence loud in my peripheral vision. I did not look at it directly. Looking felt like tempting fate. He spoke casually about plans for the day, about something he had read online. His tone was light, almost kind. That kindness confused me more than anger ever had. It made me question the urgency I felt coiled beneath my ribs. I nodded, responded appropriately, played my role with precision. Survival teaches performance. I had become very good at it. Inside, time felt distorted. Every minute stretched, thick with anticipation. I told myself to wait, to follow the plan, to leave when the conditions were right. Patience had kept me alive before. Still, there was a pressure building, the sense that something was accelerating beyond my control. My body knew before I did that this day was different. When he asked what I was doing later, the question landed heavier than it should have. I answered vaguely, noncommittal. His eyes lingered on me a second too long. I felt the shift then, subtle but unmistakable, like the air before a storm. Control does not like uncertainty. My independence, even hinted at, had always provoked something sharp. I remember washing my hands at the sink, watching the water run over my skin, thinking about how easily it rinsed away. I had no language yet for the thought that crossed my mind, only a sudden awareness of my own vulnerability. Skin is such a fragile boundary. It holds everything in until it doesn't. We moved through the house separately, intersecting briefly in hallways, doorways. Each encounter carried an unspoken tension. I considered leaving then, grabbing the suitcase and walking out without explanation. Fear stopped me, old and persuasive. I told myself to wait a little longer, to keep things calm. That decision, so small in the moment, echoes loudly now. When the moment came, it did not announce itself. There was no shouting, no clear escalation. Just a sudden closeness, his presence where it hadn't been a second before. My mind scrambled to catch up to understand. I remember a sharp smell, unexpected, chemical. Confusion registered first, then pain so immediate it erased everything else. My body reacted on instinct. I screamed, though I don't remember deciding to. Sound tore out of me, raw and animal. The world narrowed to sensation, heat that felt both liquid and solid, a burning that did not behave like anything I had known. Time fractured. I was dimly aware of movement, of my own hands coming up too late, of the floor beneath me. In those moments, education was brutal and instant. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not something that could be talked through or apologized for. This was violence, deliberate and irreversible. The normal morning shattered completely, replaced by a reality that would not be negotiated. As I stumbled toward the door, guided by something deeper than thought, I understood with terrifying clarity that leaving had never been the betrayal. Staying had been. The suitcase stood exactly where I had left it, absurd and useless now. A symbol of a plan that had assumed time was on my side. Pain rewrote everything I thought I knew, but beneath it, one truth burned just as fiercely. I had been right to want to go. I remember fragments more than a sequence. Sound arrived before sight, voices overlapping, sharp with urgency. Someone was shouting my name, or maybe just shouting. My face felt wrong, like it no longer belonged to me, like the concept of sensation had been replaced by something raw and endless. I could not open my eyes without pain exploding outward, so I kept them shut and followed instructions I barely understood. Lie still, don't touch, breathe. In the ambulance, the air smelled clean and metallic. Hands moved with practiced care, firm and gentle at the same time. That contrast mattered. It taught me, even then, that touch could exist without threat. I clung to that knowledge while my body trembled uncontrollably, shock setting in as the adrenaline drained away. Someone asked me questions to keep me conscious. My name, the date, what happened. I answered what I could, the rest dissolving into noise. At the hospital, time stretched again, elastic and unreliable. Pain came in waves, each one convincing me it was the worst so far. I learned quickly that endurance had a different meaning now. This was not about staying quiet or making things easier for someone else. This was about surviving what had been done to me, minute by minute, without bargaining with reality. There would be no apology large enough to undo this. When they told me what had happened in clear terms, without euphemism, it landed with a strange calm. Acid attack, intentional, severe. Naming it did not make it hurt less, but it anchored the experience in truth. I was not overreacting. I was not confused. What had occurred had a name, and that name carried weight beyond my private pain. I asked about my face, my eyes, my future. The answers were careful, honest without being cruel. Uncertainty was unavoidable. Healing would be long. Some damage would remain. I listened and nodded, absorbing information like a student because learning felt like control. Knowledge became my first tool of recovery. Understanding procedures, timelines, risks gave me something solid to hold when everything else felt unstable. There were moments when grief rose suddenly, sharp and disorienting. Not just for my appearance, but for the version of life I had imagined waiting on the other side of leaving. That life was gone now, replaced by something I had not chosen. Allowing myself to mourn, it felt necessary, even educational. Loss does not need permission to be valid. People came and went. Nurses, doctors, a social worker who spoke to me about safety and legal options. Each interaction added another layer to my understanding. What happened to me was not just personal, it was criminal. The responsibility did not belong to my choices, my timing, my hesitation. It belonged entirely to the person who decided to punish autonomy with violence. In the quiet hours, when the pain medication softened the edges of consciousness, I thought about the suitcase by the door. How close I had been, how dangerous closeness can be. That thought did not fill me with regret. It filled me with clarity. Leaving had threatened his control, and control, when challenged, had revealed its true nature. The lesson was brutal but precise. As bandages were changed and plans were made, I felt something unfamiliar beneath the fear and pain. Resolve. Not the kind that demands heroism, but the kind that insists on truth. I would heal as much as possible. I would learn what this meant legally, medically, socially. I would not allow what happened to be softened into something easier for others to digest. That day divided my life cleanly, not into before and after pain, but into ignorance and knowledge. My skin would heal imperfectly. Memory would not. And from that permanence, I understood something essential. Survival is not passive. It is an active, educated refusal to disappear, even when the world has tried to erase you. Leaving the hospital did not feel like freedom. It felt like exposure. The world I stepped back into was the same one I had left, but I was not the same person walking through it. My face was bandaged, my movements cautious, my confidence stripped down to something skeletal. Every reflective surface became a negotiation. Mirrors were optional. Windows were not. The first time I went outside, the air felt too sharp against my skin, as if it knew where I was most vulnerable. People looked at me quickly and then looked away, their discomfort almost louder than curiosity. I learned how visible pain makes others uneasy, how it disrupts their sense of order. That reaction educated me in a way books never could. Suffering is tolerated best when it remains private. I became hyper-aware of space. The distance between my body and others mattered more now. Crowded rooms overwhelmed me, not because of noise, but because I could not control who saw me. I practiced holding my head steady, meeting eyes without apology. Some days I succeeded. Other days, I chose invisibility and did not punish myself for it. Healing is not linear, it negotiates. There were moments of unexpected kindness. A stranger holding a door a second longer than necessary. A cashier who spoke gently without pity. Those moments mattered because they reminded me that the public world was not uniformly hostile. Still, each interaction carried a cost. I measured my energy carefully, rationed it like medicine. I had to relearn language. How to answer questions without educating everyone. How to say no without explanation. How to claim privacy without sounding ashamed. People wanted narratives that made them comfortable, stories with clean lessons and clear villains. I was not ready to perform my trauma for their understanding. Silence became another boundary, and boundaries were something I was finally allowed to have. My body continued to teach me. Pain flared unpredictably, reminding me that recovery was active work. Physical therapy, appointments, routines structured my days. There was discipline in it, a strange comfort in showing up for myself repeatedly. Each small improvement felt earned. Each setback demanded patience I was still learning. What surprised me most was how much strength living openly required. It was easier to hide, to disappear into controlled environments. Choosing visibility, even limited, felt radical. I began to understand resilience not as toughness, but as persistence, showing up imperfectly, taking space without asking permission. I thought often about education, not formal but experiential. About how many signs I had missed before, how little I had known about the realities of violence, recovery, survival. I wished I had been taught earlier what control looks like, how danger escalates, what resources exist. That wish settled into something heavier than regret. It settled into responsibility. By the end of that period, public spaces no longer felt like battlegrounds, but they were not neutral either. They were classrooms. Every outing taught me something about fear, empathy, and my own capacity to adapt. I was learning how to exist again, not as I had been, but as someone changed who still belonged. I did not reclaim the world all at once. I claimed it inch by inch, step by careful step. And with each step, I understood that survival was not just about being alive. It was about being seen and choosing, again and again, not to retreat. The legal language arrived slowly, layered over my days like a new accent I had to learn. Assault, aggravated, intent. Each word carried precision that emotion never could. When the police officer spoke to me, there was no hesitation in his voice, no attempt to soften the truth. What had been done to me was a crime, not a loss of control. Not a moment of passion, a decision with consequences. Hearing that spoken aloud grounded me in a way sympathy never had. Giving my statement was exhausting in a different way than pain. I had to place events in order, to resist the urge to minimize, to describe details without dissociating. Memory resisted structure. It came in flashes, sensory, and sharp. I learned techniques to stay present, to breathe through it, to pause without apologizing. The room was quiet when I finished. No one rushed me. That respect mattered more than I expected. I noticed how often people searched my face for forgiveness I did not owe. They wanted me to say I understood why it happened, to offer context that would make the violence feel less frightening. I refused that role. Understanding patterns is not the same as excusing behavior. Education sharpened that distinction for me. Accountability does not require hatred, it requires clarity. There were days when anger surfaced unexpectedly, hot and disorienting. I welcomed it. Anger meant my boundaries were alive. For years, I had redirected it inward, sanding it down until it became compliance. Now, it had a purpose. It kept me aligned with the facts when doubt crept in. It reminded me that what happened was not abstract. It had altered my body, my routines, my sense of safety. Court dates were scheduled. Paperwork accumulated. I learned how systems move, slowly, imperfectly, but forward. I learned how to ask questions without shrinking, how to insist on information, how to tolerate waiting without interpreting it as dismissal. Justice was not dramatic, it was procedural. That reality disappointed and steadied me at the same time. I also learned where the system strained, how often survivors are asked to be consistent when trauma disrupts consistency, how credibility is measured by calm when pain rarely presents calmly. Knowing this did not break me, it educated me. It clarified where support mattered most and where advocacy was necessary. Knowledge became armor. Friends asked what I needed. Sometimes I knew, sometimes I didn't. I practiced honesty without explanation. I need company, I need quiet, I need time. Needs are not debts. Saying that aloud felt radical. Each boundary I set was a small correction to years of training that had taught me to disappear. When the charge was read back to me, formal and unembellished, I felt a strange sense of relief. The act had been named correctly, not softened, not reframed. The language did not capture the full reality of my experience, but it did something essential. It placed responsibility where it belonged. That placement was not symbolic, it was structural. I understood then that part of my recovery would involve speaking, not because I owed the world a lesson, but because silence had been used against me for too long. Naming what happened was not a performance. It was an alignment with truth, and truth, once aligned, has weight. I walked out of that building tired, but steadier than when I had entered. The path ahead was still uncertain, but it was defined by facts rather than fear. What had happened to me had a name now, and that name no longer lived only inside my body. Rebuilding did not arrive with motivation. It arrived with necessity. Bills did not pause for trauma. Appointments did not schedule themselves. Life insisted on continuation, and at first I resented that insistence. It felt unfair to be asked to participate in a world that had already taken so much. Over time, that resentment shifted. Participation became proof that I was still here on my own terms. I learned to make decisions without checking for someone else's reaction. That sounds simple until you've spent years calibrating yourself around another person's moods. The first time I chose something purely because I wanted it, a haircut that revealed my scars instead of hiding them, I cried afterward, overwhelmed by the unfamiliar weight of autonomy. Freedom is not light when you've never been allowed to carry it before. My days developed structure again, but it was a structure I built consciously. Therapy sessions, medical follow-ups, quiet routines that honored my limits. I stopped measuring progress by how close I came to who I used to be. That comparison was cruel and unnecessary. The person I was becoming deserved attention without nostalgia interfering. Growth does not mean restoration. Sometimes it means evolution. I confronted the mirror gradually. At first in pieces, an eye, a cheek, a profile, I narrated what I saw without judgment the way a professional might describe facts. Scar tissue, asymmetry, healing, language matters. I refused words that framed my face as ruined. Changed was accurate. Survived was more accurate still. There were setbacks that knocked the breath out of me. Infections, legal delays, nights when pain returned sharply, reminding me that recovery is not a straight line. On those nights, I reminded myself that resilience is not constant strength. It is returning after collapse without self-contempt. I practiced that deliberately. I also began to speak when invited, selectively, on my own terms. Not to relive the worst moments, but to explain patterns, risks, realities people preferred to ignore. Education felt different now. It was no longer abstract. It lived in my body, in my voice. When someone listened and understood something new, I felt a small shift in the world, subtle but real. What surprised me was how little permission I needed once I stopped asking for it. I did not need universal understanding to move forward. I needed alignment with myself. The approval I had chased for years had never protected me. My own clarity did. There were moments of joy that arrived unexpectedly. Laughter that did not check the room first. Calm that did not feel temporary. These moments did not erase what happened, but they coexisted with it, expanding the space I occupied. I let them. Rebuilding taught me patience I never wanted to learn and strength I did not know I had. It also taught me that survival is not the end of the story. It is the foundation. From it, I was constructing something deliberate, informed, and unapologetically mine. I did not rebuild the life I planned before the suitcase by the door. I rebuilt something more honest, something that did not require endurance as proof of love or silence as the price of safety. And for the first time, that felt like enough to keep going. The courtroom was colder than I expected, not in temperature but in tone. Everything echoed, footsteps, papers shifting, my own breathing when I forgot to slow it. I sat where I was told, hands folded because they needed somewhere to rest, and waited while the system arranged itself around me. This was supposed to be the place where truth mattered most, and yet it felt profoundly procedural, as if the gravity of what had happened had to fit into margins and schedules. When they spoke his name, my body reacted before my mind did. A tightening, a surge of heat, a memory that tried to reclaim territory. I anchored myself to the chair, pressed my feet into the floor, reminded myself where I was and why. Presence had become a skill I practiced deliberately. I would not disappear in this room. Listening to the facts laid out was surreal. Dates, actions, consequences, all delivered in a voice trained to remain neutral. The neutrality did not offend me. It reassured me. It meant this was not about emotions competing for attention. It was about responsibility. The language did its work carefully, stripping away excuses, leaving only decisions and outcomes. When it was my turn to speak, the room seemed to narrow. I did not perform pain. I did not raise my voice. I spoke plainly about impact, about recovery, about permanence, about the ways violence extends far beyond the moment it occurs. Education guided me here. I knew that clarity was more powerful than rage, that specificity carried weight. I watched faces shift as understanding landed, not dramatically, but measurably. The sentence itself was not cinematic. No single moment delivered closure like a blow. It was numbers and conditions, consequences articulated within the limits of the law. Some part of me wanted more, something that could equal the scale of what had been taken. Another part recognized the danger of that desire. Justice is not restoration. It is acknowledgement with teeth. As the words settled into the room, I felt a complex relief. Not triumph, not satisfaction. Relief that accountability existed outside my body now, documented, enforced. The burden of proof was no longer mine to carry alone. That mattered. Walking out afterward, the building felt unchanged, but I was not. The weight I carried had shifted. It was still heavy, but distributed differently, no longer concentrated in silence or self-doubt. The system was imperfect, slow, constrained. Still, it had moved. And in moving, it had affirmed something essential. What happened to me mattered enough to respond to. I did not expect peace to arrive with the verdict, and it didn't. What arrived instead was space. Space to grieve without questioning myself. Space to plan without fear of interruption. space to imagine a future that did not revolve around survival alone. The sentence did not define me. It defined him. That distinction was educational in the deepest sense. Responsibility has a direction, violence has an author, and my life, altered as it was, belonged forward, not backward.